You're listening to Uptown Radio. It's Thursday, March 24th. I'm Chantel Dastra.
And I'm Elliot Chaparelli. There's been an increase in car crash fatalities in New York City this year. We'll look into what the city can do about it.
Red light cameras are absolutely essential tools. We have elected officials who just don't have the courage to do what they know is right.
And the Affordable Art Fair opened in Chelsea today. We asked gallery owners, artists, and viewers what they think of the new kind of digital artwork known as NFTs or non-fungible tokens.
I'm not a fan of NFTs. I see it very much as a currency rather than about the artwork. And I think one of the biggest things of artwork is you should be able to enjoy it in the flesh.
And also on our show today, a math question. How many squirrels live in Central Park?
Best guess.
200,000.
All this and more on Uptown Radio. But first, the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Amy Held. President Biden is working to show a unified front against Russia 1 month into its invasion of Ukraine. He's meeting now with allies in Brussels. NATO promised Kyiv new military support and assigned more troops to its eastern flank. Biden says the goal of Russia's President Vladimir Putin has been to break up the alliance.
The single most important thing is for us to stay unified. And the world continue to focus on what a brute this guy is. And all the innocent people's lives are being lost and ruined.
Biden committed an additional $1 billion in humanitarian relief for Ukrainians and announced new sanctions against Russia. Pressed at a news conference about sanctions' failure to deter Putin so far, Biden said if kept up for the months ahead, they will stop him. NATO is warning China not to get in the way and to refrain from helping Russia's war effort in any way. NPR's Asma Khalid reports.
In particular, their concerns have been that China could possibly help Russia circumvent some of these sanctions or possibly assist Russia in military equipment. The White House has said it has made it very clear to China that if it were to do either one of those things, there would be consequences. But the president said today that there was an acknowledgement among NATO allies that they need to create some sort of mechanism to help to detect who is trying to circumvent these sanctions.
China has condemned Western sanctions, not Russia's invasion, though it has called for an end to the war. Ukrainian cities, meantime, are coming under relentless Russian fire, and Ukraine says Russia has forced hundreds of thousands of its citizens into Russia against their will. Moscow says it's relocating or evacuating them. Meantime, the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly approved a resolution today calling for an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine and blaming Russia for the humanitarian crisis there. The Senate Judiciary Committee has wrapped up confirmation hearings for Supreme Court nominee Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. NPR's Barbara Sprunt reports outside witnesses gave testimony today.
In one of the more heated exchanges of the hearings, Illinois Democrat Dick Durbin forcefully rejected an unusual GOP demand. Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee had pushed for committee members to view various pre-sentencing reports in child pornography cases that Jackson oversaw. Such reports are kept confidential in order to protect victims' privacy.
I'm sorry, Senator, I'm not going to be party to that. I would not want that on my conscience, that we did this for some political exercise here, which I think is totally unnecessary, and someone was harmed as a result of it. I'm going to resist it every step of the way.
Durbin noted that the Senate Judiciary Committee has never before requested that type of information. Barbara Sprunt, NPR News, Washington.
It's NPR News.
From Columbia Radio News in New York, I'm Rebecca Robinson. New York's iconic yellow taxis are about to be listed on the Uber app. The city's 14,000 cabs will start to be available through the app later this spring. New York's taxi industry has been at odds with the rideshare apps since they were first introduced. Under the plan, taxi riders who hail the cab via Uber will pay the Uber price, not what it says on the meter. Uber has already listed cabs on its platform in other markets, including Spain, South Korea, and Germany. Athletes and entertainers in New York will no longer be subject to the city's vaccine mandate. New York City Mayor Eric Adams made the announcement today. He says the shift will even the playing field for New York teams that will help with the city's economic recovery. The exception will allow unvaccinated Brooklyn Nets star Kyrie Irving to finally play home games. New York City lost over 300,000 people from its population in its first full year of the pandemic. That's according to new census data released today. New York topped the list of metropolitan areas with the highest exodus. It was followed by Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Chicago. The states of New Jersey and New York will still have to work together in fighting crime on the waterfront. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that, at least for now, New Jersey can't unilaterally withdraw from the Waterfront Commission. Jersey claimed that organized crime has already been driven from their port operations, and they wanted to go alone. New York says that if the commission is disbanded, criminals will just waltz back in. Wall Street executives received bonuses averaging over $250,000. That's according to State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli. He says that record Wall Street profits last year led to workers receiving, on average, 20% increase in bonuses. This will allow the state to raise more income tax revenue than has been expected. The NBA regular season is winding down. The Knicks will take on the Miami Heat tomorrow at 8 p.m. in an away game. It's 45 degrees and rainy day here in Upper Manhattan. The rain will continue into night, but we could see some more sunshine tomorrow. This is Rebecca Robinson, Columbia Radio News.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Chantal Destra.
And I'm Elliot Chaparelli. Motorists in Connecticut could soon have some relief from high gas prices. Yesterday, the state legislature passed a gas tax holiday, a 3-month break from state taxes collected at the pump. Other states, including Maryland and Georgia, have also proposed or passed gas tax cuts. Jelly Ha is an economist with the University of Pennsylvania's Penn Wharton budget model. She and her colleagues analyzed what a suspension of a federal gas tax would mean for consumers. I asked her just how much gas tax can save drivers.
What we find is if we suspend the federal gasoline tax from March to December this year, it would lower the average gasoline spending per capita by between $16 and $47, depending on the modeling assumption. But at the same time, it's going to lower the federal tax revenue by around $20 billion over that period.
Break that down for me again. So if the federal government lowers the tax, consumers aren't necessarily going to see the full amount of that tax decrease?
It's unlikely that producers will pass entire savings to consumers in the form of lower prices. So what you will see is the prices would reduce by a smaller amount compared to the amount of the suspended taxes. And typically, it really depends on how the market in the gasoline works. So demand for gasoline in the short run is pretty inelastic. So that basically means consumers, it's not easy for them to lower their consumption in response to higher prices, right? So some of them have to drive to work, and that's their main mode of transportation. So it's not easy to, say, switch to a different transportation mode. So in that case, they would only pass half or just a portion of the lower taxes to consumers in the form of lower prices.
Will the loss of this revenue impact government spending on infrastructure and highways? And how will the consumers see that?
The revenue from the federal gasoline tax is used for the Highway Trust Fund. And that basically helps to finance almost most of the government spending on highway and also mass transit. So with a loss of $20 billion over 10 months, it's going to have a huge impact on the solvency of the trust fund. And it has already been experiencing some issues with not enough revenue. So we will definitely see a problem with the Highway Trust Fund. And that will, again, just have a negative impact on the amount of finances for the highway and mass transit when really we need it the most.
Since gas taxes are such a small amount of the overall price of gas, is there a better way to decrease the price of gas than to change the taxes?
So basically, the price of crude oil is one of the biggest factors that affect the retail price of gasoline, right? And we know that oil prices have also been surging recently. So it reached over $130 per barrel at one time recently. And so that's basically, again, due to how the market works. So back in at the onset of the pandemic, a lot of producers reduced their output significantly because the demand for, say, diesel, gasoline dropped a lot because of the lockdowns. And once more economies opened up, demand quickly just outpaced supply. And producers having a hard time trying to catch up with the increased demand. So a lot of oil companies have decided not to increase drilling just because of fear for a collapse in prices. So the best way to keep prices in check will be to increase supply. So the US and also some international energy agency member countries have agreed to release 60 million barrels from their emergency stockpiles. So that will increase supply and that will be helpful.
Zheliha, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me on.
The progressive wing of New York's Democratic Party isn't happy with the proposal to spend state tax dollars on football. Governor Kathy Hochul recently said she wants to make a deal with the Buffalo Bills to build a brand new stadium and likely subsidize the project. Today, a coalition of activists staged a rally outside of Hochul's New York City office to protest the stadium deal. Uptown Radio's David Marquez went down to Midtown to find out where they want to see that money go instead.
Hell no to Cuomo 2.0!
A crowd forms in front of a glassy 3rd Avenue skyscraper, chanting slogans and holding banners. They don't mince words when they denounce Hochul's stadium plan. A new stadium for the Buffalo Bills could cost as much as $1.4 billion. Governor Hochul hasn't formally announced exactly how much tax money would go to the stadium, but estimates have ranged as high as $1 billion. The protesters here say you could do a lot of other things with that money.
You know, the NFL has enough money as it is. We don't need to be giving more money to the NFL to just, make another stadium.
Leona Lopez wants to see Hochul embrace more money for housing instead. He was excited to see the state pass the Honda Act last year, which allows for the conversion of unused hotels into permanent housing. But he's worried about its future.
We think it's a really good idea, but we think that it is severely underfunded, and we specifically, I think we want specifically $100 million more for that project instead.
The protesters all had things they'd rather have funded, everything from bail reform to community policing. But the purpose of today's protest was also political. Many of the people there are supporters of Jumaane Williams, New York City's public advocate. Williams is looking to replace Hochul as the Democratic nominee for governor later this year. As in past races, he has the support of New York's progressives. Williams spoke to the crowd and said that Hochul's approach to public safety relies on outdated and inaccurate ideas about the role of police.
There are people I went to high school with who are dead from gun violence. We were told in the 90s that heavy police presence is what was going to solve it. If that would have solved it, would have been solved already.
Williams is far behind in the race for governor. Polls consistently have Hochul commanding the small field by a large margin. Bobby Finkelstein, an activist with the congregation Beth Elohim in Park Slope, is backing Williams despite the odds.
I do think he has a hard road compared to Hochul, both in name recognition and money, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for people that are working towards the reforms that we feel are important.
Any stadium deal will likely be a major point of contention in the election season ahead. Governor Hochul argues that she just wants to make sure that the Bills stay in Buffalo, and any stadium would have many different revenue sources. Hochul says she expects to wrap up the Bills deal before the state budget is due on April 1st. David Marquez, Columbia Radio News.
Really play wrong notes unless you really try to make it, so whatever you end up doing will sound probably interesting at the very least.
Brian Durrell is a musician, and he lives in Harlem.
This is something that I built in Max MSP, which is a visual programming language. This is designed to recreate music from scratch, as if following some of the rules that a real musician would follow, but without a real musician having to make any of the choices. Because in Macs everything is connected with cables that show the flow of signal or the flow of data. It kind of looks like this crazy spider web that I've got set up here, and once you know where everything's going, you can see where to pull and push on things to make things happen.
You're listening to Uptown Radio from Columbia Radio News, Thursdays at 4 p.m.
From Columbia Radio News, I'm Linnea Arden. President Biden met with leaders of the European Union today to discuss the war in Ukraine amid growing concerns of a chemical weapons escalation. During the talks in Brussels, Biden said the United States would welcome Ukrainians fleeing the war.
Closer to their homes. But we've also will welcome 100,000 Ukrainians to the United States with a focus on reuniting families.
The president also pledged $1 billion in aid to support European countries in the ongoing refugee crisis. President Biden also called for Russia to be removed from the G20 nations, and if they are not, for Ukraine to be allowed to participate in G20 meetings. Ukrainian forces claimed today that they destroyed a Russian landing ship in an attack port in the south. European lawmakers met today to push forward the Digital Markets Act, a sweeping legislation designed to regulate tech companies. The law would impose new obligations and prohibitions on the largest digital and tech firms and would be backed by substantial fines if the companies don't comply. Critics are calling the law a discriminatory attack on big American tech. 4 days of hearings wrapped today for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson's nomination to the Supreme Court. The full Senate is expected to vote on the confirmation on April 4th. If confirmed, Jackson would become the first ever black female Supreme Court judge. Microscopic bits of plastic are common in human blood. That's according to a new report issued today in the journal Environment International. The Amsterdam-based research group found microplastic pollution in 80% of humans tested during the study. Half of the samples included plastic commonly used in water bottles. A third contained polystyrene used for packaging. U.S. stocks rose today after a sell-off on Wednesday. The S&P 500, NASDAQ, and Dow Jones were all up around 1%. This is Linnea Arden, Columbia Radio News.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Elliot Schiaparelli.
And I'm Chantal Destra. According to a new report by the Times Union, Apple has been lobbying New York State. The tech company wants the state to allow New Yorkers to store government-issued IDs, including driver's licenses, in digital wallets. Nick Guggenberger is the executive director of the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. I asked about the implications of a trade-off many of us are familiar with: convenience in exchange for sharing our private information with large corporations. So to play devil's advocate a little bit, don't we already give our information to companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon? And it's really no secret that advertisers push discounts to consumers through this information passing. So are digital driver's licenses really any that different when it comes to private entities taking a hold of our private information?
First, let's start with a type of information. So there is information that is just by its very nature more sensitive than other information. Health information is an example for that. Your physical address can be an example of that. That might be more critical to keep secret and private than, let's say, I don't know, what you last shopped on Amazon. And second, it might be entities that you're specifically concerned about. So in the case of the driver's license, or if that route were to be followed, it would privatize the, now in air quotes, business of identification. And that is, I think, a major problem. It would further strengthen corporate power, and it would create additional significant lock-in effects that make it harder for people to switch digital services, and that will create structures where you where your private information, your personal data, is even more exposed to large and powerful digital platforms.
So on one hand, digital driver's licenses could be really convenient, but as we've spoken about, there are a lot of privacy concerns. So from your perspective, does the benefit outweigh the privacy risk?
The costs very much depend on how you build such a system. And two major aspects that determine these costs are: one, what type of security measures do you build into the system? And the other big question is, who gets access to that information for what purpose? Both these questions can be answered in very, very different ways. There's some states that offer their own apps that allow you to store this type of personal information. There are other approaches where private companies offer that service. And the threats or potential or concerns associated vary a lot, depending on whether it is the state that offers that directly or whether that is a private corporation. But that is just to say that it is really very much a question on how you design these systems, who operates them, and under what limitations.
And one of the major privacy concerns raised about this is the possibility that hackers could get a hold of the private information. As an expert in cyber privacy, what are your thoughts on this specific concern?
It is much broader than that. And the real concern is about an abuse of the data or information that is digitally stored. Abuse can happen by private entities, by corporations that use that or abuse that information in a way that they shouldn't. It can also be abused by government entities in order to further state surveillance. And so I think while this concern that you mentioned is certainly valid, it is just sort of a very narrow version of a much broader concern about cybersecurity, privacy, and protection from surveillance.
So what are some of the extra guardrails or security steps that the New York State DMV could potentially put in place to ensure that New Yorkers have their private information protected with these digital licenses?
At a policy level, I think the most important restriction or limitation is on the usage of the information. So to clearly spell out what this digitally stored information and data can be used for and what it must not be used for. Now, on top of that, they just need to build a system that can't be hacked.
Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Chantal. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
It's only March and already 57 people have been killed in traffic collisions in New York City. Last month was the deadliest February for traffic crashes in almost a decade and a half. Now, new data reveals that part of the cause may be an uptick in red light running. New York City has a solution, though: red light cameras. But it's run into a problem: the state government. Linnea Arden has more.
If you're standing at the corner of Atlantic and Flatbush Avenues just outside the Barclays Center in Brooklyn and try to cross the street, you need to make it through 6 lanes of speeding cars and trucks. Just a few weeks ago, a pedestrian was struck and killed there. The intersection is now known as a death trap by locals, so Brooklynite Ruby Shaw has a strategy.
I don't know if it's because I make pretty intense eye contact with the driver.
Why do you do that?
So that they know that they should stop. Or it's either that or I put my hands out.
The city has been using red light cameras to try to reduce traffic fatalities for years. There are 150 of them spread out throughout the 5 boroughs. They photograph the driver's license plates and slap them with a $50 fine if they run a red light. Now, a new study from nonprofit Transportation Alternatives says last year red light cameras recorded the highest number of violations in almost a decade.
Because I am from Long Island, they have red light cameras everywhere, and they are pretty strict about it. I've gotten 1 or 2 red light tickets, so I've been more careful about that since, but I do think they would help significantly.
According to Transportation Alternatives, Shaw's right. Where cameras were installed, traffic violations dropped by more than 80%. But the city has a problem: Albany. The state governs how many cameras New York City can install, And now that number, 150, only cover 1% of the city's many intersections. And according to the state, New York City also can't operate those cameras at night or on weekends when 40% of these collisions happen. Sam Swartz was the city's traffic commissioner in the 80s. Now he's a consultant and behind many of the city's plans to increase pedestrian safety. He knows about the fight with Albany.
I believe speed cameras, red light cameras are absolutely essential tools. And we have elected officials who just don't have the courage to do what they know is right.
So city officials say their hands are tied. In a recent tweet, Mayor Eric Adams pushed for home rule, which he says would give the city the local power it needs to install more cameras. But even if it could, there would be another problem. An increase in reckless driving New York is seeing as part of a national trend. Swartz says it appears to be related to a breakdown in social norms due to the pandemic.
I believe it's the fatalistic attitude people may have confronted with so much death that you see people doing things that are unfathomable. Somebody getting hit by a car from somebody doing donuts in the Soho area. You know, that's crazy. I never saw that before in all my years.
The governor's office didn't respond to a request in time for air regarding New York City's fight for more local control. So for now, pedestrian Ruby Shah is going to continue her no-nonsense crossing tactics. Linnea Arden, Columbia Radio News.
NFTs, or non-fungible tokens, became a hot topic last year after a digital artist, Beeple, sold an NFT for $69 million at a record-setting Christie's auction. But as Uptown Radio's Sarah Yukabitis finds, many artists aren't ready to toss their physical brushes and canvases aside to jump on the latest technological bandwagon.
It's the opening night for the Affordable Art Fair, and 22-year-old Jacob Talbot is a photographer and multidisciplinary artist making his New York City debut. His dark, moody photographs are covering a section of the Metropolitan Pavilion's bright white walls in Chelsea. He says that while younger artists like him have a better understanding of technology, they're also more aware of the potential downsides.
I'm not a fan of NFTs. I see it very much as a currency rather than about the artwork. And I think one of the biggest things of artwork is you should be able to enjoy it in the flesh.
The place is brimming with color, energy, and stylishly dressed collectors. Surrounded by so much art, it's hard to imagine how different these galleries would be if NFTs became the norm.
At the end of the day, the artwork is something that should be free and affordable for anyone to enjoy. And I think NFTs is a way of monetizing that and making it a lot more, what's the right word? Capitalist.
Prices here range from $10,000 to $10,000, thus the name the Affordable Art Fair. The organizers admit affordability is all relative, but Talbot believes that art should be accessible to the general public, and that belief extends beyond pricing.
And I think it's making, you know, I'm all for someone buying a piece of real artwork, having it on their wall and enjoying it every day. But to buy something on a computer and never actually see it in the flesh, I think is quite weird for me.
Down the hall, standing in front of a wall of painted color wheels, After 9 Contemporary Gallery Associate Director Laura Green says she's intrigued by the idea of NFTs, but not sold yet.
I mean, obviously, a lot of people are talking about NFTs, but it's not necessarily something I buy into. I think it's a bit of a fad, but that's my personal opinion. It's not the reflection of the gallery at all.
Still, art is a business, and she'd like to see her artists expand into the rapidly growing field. On the second floor of the art fair, Sue Dean is displaying several large portraits from her gallery in England. She has seen an uptick in online sales during the pandemic, but they're for traditional physical works of art. She's not sure NFTs are the right fit for her gallery.
We're all about real painting. We're painting and drawing in colour and light, and we talk to our artists about the future. But for many of them, NFTs is something in the distance.
NFTs may be art's future, but for now, most of the artists here are keeping their art on the walls and off the blockchain. Sarah Yukabitis, Columbia Radio News.
How many squirrels are there in Central Park? It's not just a trivia question for a dinner party. The answer actually tells us a lot about the urban environment, and one organization is getting citizen volunteers to figure it out. Rebecca Robinson reports.
If there's a number one squirrel fan in New York City, it's Stuart Bowler.
It's like if you just open your eyes and watch them and just interact with them a little bit, you'll see how much they are part of, especially New York, but a lot of other cities too.
Bowler lives in the East Village, and a few years ago, he spotted something strange on Instagram. A group called the Squirrel Census.
And then I found people that were interested in the same thing I was interested in. Like, wow, well, this is right up my alley.
And became a volunteer squirrel counter. Here's how the census works. Over the course of several days, volunteers like Bowler are assigned a small section of a park and asked to go there twice a day to count the squirrels that they see. Jamie Allen is the creator of the census, and he says the volunteers bring back more than just a number.
And you're tuned in to everything that's happening there. So, and it's your job to pay attention to everything that's happening and capture what's happening.
Each volunteer gets a tally sheet where they record each squirrel that they see. The fur color, what they're up to, running, chasing, eating. They also record the state of the park, the amount of trash they see, the number of people, and other observations.
And you go in there and you count its citizens. The squirrels are the citizens we chose to focus on, but at the same time, we're getting a profile of the park and the needs that it might have.
It's not easy. I tried the count out for myself with a tally sheet provided by the Squirrel Census. I only saw 3 squirrels and recorded the sound of one. The Squirrel Census recently released its 2020 results. So how many squirrels are really in Central Park? I asked a few evening park goers to guess.
Somewhere between like 750 to 1,500 squirrels, but that number just seems low to me. I don't know, like if I had to guess on the top of my head, it'd be like 10,000.
36,000.
Best guess.
200,000.
The correct answer? The Squirrel Census estimates that there are 2,373 squirrels in Central Park. 2,373. Whether you think that's high or low, for scientists, it's a hopeful number. Professor Colin Jerelmack is the chair of environmental studies at NYU. He says squirrels in New York almost died off in the late 1800s. Since then, their population has boomed.
And so it shows you that these animals have not only are resilient or surviving, but have actually successfully adapted to do better in these human-altered settings.
So far, it's too early to get accurate trends on the squirrel population. The Squirrel Census hopes to keep doing this count and track how the city is changing. They also say that you can't stop at squirrels. There should be an ongoing census for all sorts of factors, like raptor sightings and even the number of rats. Might be hard to get volunteers for that one. Rebecca Robinson, Columbia Radio News.
That's it for this week's Uptown Radio.
David Newtown was our executive producer today. Leading our staff of reporters was senior producer Julian Abraham. Our day reporters were David Marquez and Sarah Yukabaitis.
Director Clara Sophia Daly coordinated our studio production with Mark Gilchrist and Lucy Grindon.
Our web editor, Rebecca Robinson, got this stream live to the web. Rebecca Robinson and Linnea Arden produced the news with additional reporting from my co-host, Elliot Schiaparelli. Senior editor Lucy Grindon led our copy team.
Our instructors Sally Herships, Robert Smith, and Ben Shapiro, as well as Haley Zhao, advised our staff. I'm Elliot Schiaparelli.
And I'm Chantel Destra. Uptown Radio is live every Thursday at 4. Until next time, you can always find us on uptownradio.org. From all of us here at Uptown Radio, thanks for listening.